Hello, my name is Avind. For many who may be reading this on some forum or community, that name might not mean anything, but some of you might remember my old title, Swami Aravinda Andanda. For 33 years, that was my identity. I was a Hindu monk. My whole life was dedicated to it, living in ashrams, seeking the truth in deep meditation, often in isolated caves in northern India. Today, my life is something I never could have imagined. Today, I follow Jesus Christ. I feel the need to share how this happened, and I ask, from the bottom of my heart, that you listen to me. I am not here to attack or disrespect the faith that was my foundation for decades. I am sharing this solely because what happened to me was real. It was not a dream. It was not a hallucination. It was an experience that redefined reality itself for me and changed every atom of my being. And I believe, with everything I am, that if God could reveal himself to me, a Swami, in the way he did, he can reveal himself to anyone who truly seeks him. This is my story. I was born in Haridwar, a holy city on the banks of our most sacred river, the Ganges. My parents named me Arvind Kumar. We were Brahmins, which means we belonged to the priestly caste. My father was, in fact, a temple priest, and my mother was, without exaggeration, the most devout woman I ever knew. My childhood does not smell of grandmother's cooking or wet earth. My childhood smells, vividly in my memory, of incense and sandalwood. It was a constant odor, hanging in our house, emanating from our family altar. My entire life was dictated by rituals. Before the sun even thought about rising, the first sound I heard every day was my mother, already awake, chanting her mantras, and the high, clear ring of the small brass bell she used in her morning prayers. My education was like this. I learned to recite complex prayers in Sanskrit before I could even memorize the multiplication tables in school. My reality was the temple. I spent more time there, observing my father's rituals, than in the schoolyard or playing on the street. The central figure of my childhood, besides my parents, was my grandmother. She lived with us, and it was she who, at night, told me the great sacred stories, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. I can still see her wrinkled hands gesticulating in the air, her eyes shining as she described powerful gods, terrifying demons, the meaning of duty, and the power of devotion. I was a quiet, observant child. While the other boys my age spent their energy playing cricket in the dusty streets, I preferred to stand by the window, just watching the constant flow of pilgrims passing by our house. They walked, always with a focused look, toward the ghats, the staircases leading to the river, for their ritual baths. I wondered obsessively about them. Where did they come from? What were they seeking with such fervor? Did they really find what they were looking for when they plunged into those waters? These questions about the pilgrims were just the beginning. From a very early age, I carried doubts that deeply troubled me, things that felt wrong to question. When I saw the beggars at the temple gates, I asked my father why God, being so powerful, allowed so much suffering. He gave me the answer we all knew. The standard answer, karma. He explained to me, patiently, that those people were merely paying for terrible sins they had committed in past lives. But, even as just a boy, something in my heart was not settled by that explanation. It didn't feel right. When I saw sick people, dying people, people crying from a pain I could barely imagine, I thought what unspeakably horrible things they must have done in other lives to deserve such brutal punishment. And then, when I was 11 years old, this cold theology, this distant explanation, knocked on our door with a violence that broke me. My younger sister, Mira, became ill. She was only 7. She was a light in our house, a bright girl who was always singing devotional songs while she played. But she caught a fever that would not break. My parents did absolutely everything that was expected and everything that was possible. They took her to doctors, But the medicines seemed like water. They had no effect. They took her to priests, friends of my father, who performed elaborate pujas and yajnas, expensive and complex rituals that lasted for days. My parents fasted until they were weak. They made difficult vows. They donated money we barely had to the temples, hoping to buy a miracle. The clearest image of my childhood is of my mother, prostrate on the cold stone floor before the statue of the goddess Durga, crying and loudly imploring for my sister's life. I remember my father's face, a man so proud and strong, becoming hollow, gray, his eyes sunken with worry and an absolute impotence. And I remember staying awake at night, listening to Mira's shallow, difficult breathing in the next room, and praying to every god my father and grandmother had taught me. I promised anything. I promised I would be good, that I would study harder, that I would serve them faithfully for the rest of my life, if they would just, please, cure my sister. Mira died on a Tuesday morning. The exact moment of her death coincided with the sound of the temple bells, which began to ring for the morning arti. I was sitting beside her bed, holding her small hand, which had been so hot hours before and was now growing cold. She opened her eyes, looked directly at me, tried to smile, and then she was gone. Just like that. The light simply went out of her eyes. The house filled with grief. Relatives came. Rituals were performed. The priest told us that her soul had gone on to the next birth, that it was her karma, that we should not mourn, for death is only an illusion. But I mourned, and in the middle of my mourning, a question formed in the depths of my being, a question that would haunt me for decades. If the gods are real, and if they are good, why didn't they hear our prayers? I never asked those questions out loud. Never. In our culture, in our family, doubting the gods, questioning karma in the way I was internally, was a sign of spiritual weakness, almost a heresy. It was seen as a failure of my faith, not a failure in the explanation. So, I buried those doubts. I pushed them to the back of my mind, to a dark place where I didn't have to look at them every day. I tried, with all my effort, to be the good Brahmin son they expected me to be. I continued my studies. I did very well in school. My father was proud of me. He spoke openly about how I could become an even more respected priest than he was, or perhaps a teacher, a scholar of the sacred texts. My mother, still carrying the shadow of grief for Mira, just wanted to see me married. She wanted me to give her grandchildren to fill the house with joy again. I listened to their plans. I nodded. I did what was expected of me. But, as the years passed, and I entered my late teens, that emptiness that Mira's death had opened in me did not lessen. On the contrary, it grew. I felt as if I was living on the surface of life, just going through the motions. I performed the rituals, recited the mantras, went to the temple, but it was all automatic, mechanical. There was no real peace. There was no purpose I could feel in my chest, just a hollow echo inside, a constant sense that something fundamental was missing. When I was 19 years old, something happened that changed the course of my life irreversibly. I accompanied my family to Rishikesh for the Kumbh Mela. For those who don't know, the Mela is one of the largest, if not the largest, gatherings of human beings on the planet Earth. It happens only every 12 years, and millions of pilgrims come from all parts of India, and even the world, to bathe in the sacred river. The fundamental belief is that, on certain specific and auspicious astrological days, the waters of the Ganges in Rishikesh turn into Amrita, a divine nectar capable of washing away all accumulated sins, breaking the cycle of karma, and finally guaranteeing liberation, or moksha. I had already seen crowds in Haridwar during festivals, but this was something on another scale. The city was unrecognizable, overflowing with humanity. The air was dense, heavy with the smoke of thousands of fires used for cooking. The sound was a deafening cacophony coming from all directions. Loudspeakers playing mantras, live devotional songs, bhajans, and the incessant buzzing of millions of voices. There were canvas tents spread out as far as the eye could see, and the smell. It was an overwhelming mixture of marigold flowers, spices, sewage, incense, and a palpable human electricity that I had never felt before. And everywhere you looked, amidst the ordinary crowd, there were them, the holy men, sadhus, sannyasis, nagas, monks in their saffron robes, some covered only in ashes, with long matted hair that dragged on the ground. They were, in many ways, the center of attention, the reason why many were there, seeking their teachings or just their blessing. That particular night, I walked away a bit from my family's noisy camp. I needed to breathe. I needed a moment of silence. I ended up finding myself near the main ghat, right at sunset. The Ganga Aarti, the ritual of worship to the river, was about to begin. Priests, dressed in immaculate white tunics, ascended the stone steps holding those enormous brass lamps, each with multiple lighted wicks. The flames danced high in the soft night breeze. And then, in perfect synchronization, they began the ritual. They started moving the lamps in hypnotic circular patterns, a ballet of fire and smoke, while chanting ancient hymns to Mother Ganga. The music was powerful, the smell of incense was dense, and the sound of the bells echoed across the river. And it was there, in the middle of that beauty, that massive display of devotion, that something inside me finally broke. I simply began to cry. It wasn't a silent cry. It was a deep, visceral sob that came from a place I didn't even know existed. I didn't know exactly why I was crying like that. Maybe it was the overwhelming beauty of the ritual, the pure energy of so many people focused on a single thing, the palpable devotion in the air. Or maybe, and today, I think this is the closest to the truth, it was the sudden, overwhelming feeling of how small I was, of how desperately lost I felt in the middle of it all, of how deep my desire was to find something real, something true, something that wasn't just a ritual, but truth itself. I looked at the dark river, flowing fast and eternal, as it always has and always will. I thought of the millions and millions of people who, over the centuries, came to these waters seeking purification, seeking liberation, seeking God. And the question that hit me like a physical blow was, did any of them really find what they were looking for? Or were they all just waiting, like me? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in our tent, listening to my father's snoring and my mother's soft breathing, and I knew. It wasn't a decision I made. It was a knowing that settled within me. I knew that my life was about to change forever. I could not go back to the ordinary life my parents planned for me. I could no longer live on the surface. I had to seek. I had to find the answers. I had to know, for myself, if God was real, if liberation was possible, or if all this was just an elaborate ritual to make us feel better about the inevitable suffering and emptiness of life. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else. I saw a small group of wandering monks passing by our tent. They were young, perhaps my age or a little older, with shaved heads and wearing only simple robes. They carried almost nothing, just a pot for water and a staff. There was something in their faces that struck me squarely, a quality I had never seen up close. It was peace, but it wasn't a sleepy peace. It was a detached peace, as if they had managed to leave the whole world behind and, in the process, found something infinitely better. I got up and started to follow them, keeping a safe distance, just observing. They walked in silence, seeming not to notice the bustle of the mela around them, and headed to a small ashram on the outskirts of Rishikesh. It was a very simple place, a complex with a few low buildings and a garden. Above the wooden gate, there was a simple sign, but the words written on it, I swear, entered my heart like an arrow. The sign read, "Seek the self, Know the truth. Be free. These three phrases resonated in me with an explosive force. Seek the self. Know the truth. Be free. This was it. This was exactly what I wanted. This was what I needed. It wasn't a marriage. It wasn't a job as a priest. It wasn't money or status or my family's approval. I needed to seek the self. I needed to know the truth. I desperately needed to be free. I stood outside that gate for what felt like an eternity. I knew, with absolute clarity, that if I crossed that gate, my life as I knew it would end. My family would be devastated. My father would feel that I was rejecting everything he taught me, everything he was. My mother would cry and beg me to reconsider, and her pain would be almost unbearable for me. Everyone in my community would say I was throwing my future away, that I was being selfish and ungrateful. But the pain I felt from not seeking was, at that moment, greater than the fear of seeking. So, I took a deep breath and walked in. I was greeted by an older monk who led me to the leader of the ashram, the Guru Shivananda. He was an elderly man, with a long white beard and eyes that seemed not just to look at you, but to look through you, as if they could see every doubt and every fear hidden in your soul. His presence was calm, but incredibly powerful. I prostrated myself before him, as tradition required, touching his feet as a sign of respect. When I stood up and looked at his face, he was smiling gently, as if he already knew why I was there. I told him, my voice shaking a little, that I wanted to renounce the world. I said I wanted to seek liberation, moksha. He didn't seem surprised. He just asked me, why? And that simple question opened the floodgates. I told him everything. I talked about my sister Mira, about the fever, about the unanswered prayers. I talked about the emptiness I felt ever since, about the feeling of just playing a role in life. I talked about the questions that haunted me, about karma, and the suffering I couldn't reconcile. He listened in silence, without interrupting me once, just nodding occasionally, with those eyes that seemed to understand everything. When I finally finished, exhausted from talking so much, he was quiet for a long moment. The silence in the small room was dense. Then, he told me something I didn't expect. He told me to go home. He said the spiritual path was not an escape from life, but an intense journey toward the truth, and that this journey was harder than anything I could imagine. He told me that if I truly wanted to become a monk, I should go back to my family, live with them for exactly 1 month, and think very carefully about my decision. If, after a month, I still felt the same calling, I could return, and he would accept me as his disciple. That was, without a doubt, the longest and most torturous month of my life. I returned to Haridwar with my family. The Kumbh Mela had ended, the city was returning to normal, and I tried to act normally. I tried to fit back into the routine, but it was impossible. My body was in Haridwar, but my mind, my soul was miles away, standing in front of that gate in Rishikesh. The food had no taste, the conversations made no sense. I was in a state of suspension. Finally, with 1 week left before the deadline, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I sat down with my parents in the small room of our house. My mother was smiling, talking about a possible wife that an aunt had suggested, and I had to interrupt her. I told them what I wanted to do. The effect was exactly as I feared. My mother began to cry, a silent crying that was worse than if she had screamed. She held my hands and begged me not to go. She said I was the only son left after Mira's death, that I was the light of her house, that she couldn't bear to lose me too. My father, on the other hand, reacted with anger. It was the first time I saw him angry at me. He said I was being incredibly selfish, that I was running away from my responsibilities, breaking my dharma, my sacred duty to the family, to our ancestors. My father's anger did not last long. After the initial explosion passed, that red fury faded, and was replaced by something much worse, a heavy silence, a deep sadness that filled the room. He sat in his usual chair and kept looking at me, no longer with anger, but with a heartbreaking confusion, as if I were a stranger, an enigma he couldn't solve. I tried, with the limited words I had at 19, to explain. I said, "Father, it's not that I don't love you. It's not that I'm rejecting what you taught me. I honor all of it." I tried to talk about the emptiness, about the feeling that I was just existing, not living, since Mira left. I said that the questions I had were not about the rituals, but about what was behind them. I said, "I need to know. I need to know for myself if liberation is real, or I will spend the rest of my life pretending, and I can't do that. I don't know if they really understood. Honestly, I don't think so. How could they? Their world was certain, solid, defined by the traditions of generations. My world was broken, full of questions they never allowed themselves to ask. In the end, after hours of conversation that led nowhere, they gave in. It was not a joyful blessing. It was not a "Go, my son, and find your truth." It was a surrender. It was the painful acceptance that the son they knew, in a way, had already left, and they could no longer hold me. The morning I left was the most silent of my life. The air inside our house felt dense, heavy, as if sadness itself had a physical form. It was a cold November day. My mother was no longer crying loudly, but the silent tears simply would not stop rolling down her face. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her movements were mechanical, robotic, as she prepared a small canvas bag for me. She put in 2 changes of simple clothes, a little dry rice and lentils, as if I were going on a short trip, not to renounce the world. She held my hands, her skin was cold, and made me promise that I would visit when I could, that I wouldn't forget her. My father, on the other hand, did the only thing he knew how to do in moments of crisis. He resorted to ritual. He took me to our small family altar, lit an incense, and performed a small ceremony, offering prayers for my protection. It was the most painful thing I had ever witnessed. He was asking his gods, the gods I was, in a way, leaving behind, to protect me on my journey to seek something beyond them. When he finished, I bowed, as I had thousands of times, and touched his feet. Then I touched my mother's feet. It was the final gesture of respect, the formal goodbye. I put the bag on my shoulder. It was light, almost empty, but it felt like it weighed a ton. The weight was not of the objects. It was of the meaning. I turned and walked to the door. Each step felt like I was walking on broken glass. When I opened the door, the cold morning air hit my face, and it was like a slap, waking me up to the reality of what I was doing. I started walking down the street I had known since birth, the same street where I saw the pilgrims pass. I was heading toward the bus station. Haridwar was waking up. I could hear the distant temple bells, smell the smoke of burning wood and the river. Everything was exactly the same, but I was irrevocably different. I forced myself, with every fiber of my being, not to look back. I knew, with an absolute and terrifying certainty, that if I looked back, if I saw my mother's face in the doorway, I wouldn't be able to go. My courage was a fragile thing, built on pain and necessity, and it wouldn't withstand a last look at their love. So, I just kept walking, staring fixedly ahead, each step feeling like a thread breaking, disconnecting me from everything I had ever known. The feeling of solitude was total, as if I were the only person in the universe at that moment. When I arrived back at the ashram in Rishikesh, a few hours later, the place looked exactly the same as a month ago. I found Guru Shivananda in the courtyard, sweeping dry leaves with a straw broom. He didn't even seem to notice my approach, but when I was a few meters away, he stopped sweeping, turned, and looked at me. He didn't say hello or welcome back. He just stared at me with those penetrating eyes for a long moment. as if he were reading the last month of anguish on my face. Then he asked me the final question, the last door. "Are you absolutely sure?" There was no longer any shadow of a doubt in me. The pain of leaving my family had, paradoxically, solidified my decision. It had shown me how high the price was, and that I was willing to pay it. If the search wasn't real, I wouldn't have been able to leave home. I said, my voice firm, "Yes, Guruji, I am." He nodded slowly, and a slight smile touched his lips. That day, he formally accepted me as his disciple. It was the beginning of my sannyasa, my official renunciation of the world. He performed the ritual, and I exchanged my home clothes for the saffron robes. And then he gave me my new name, a name that would erase my previous identity, that would erase Arvind Kumar. He called me Aravinda Andanda. It means the bliss of the lotus, he explained, his voice calm. The lotus, Aravinda, grows in the muddy water, but it rises above it, untouched by the mud, to blossom in absolute purity. This, he said, pointing to me, will be your path, to rise above the mud of worldly attachment and blossom into spiritual realization. My old life was over. My new life, the life of Aravinda Andanda, began before the sun even rose the next day. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a bell echoed through the ashram, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the silence of the night. It was the wake-up call. In the freezing dark, I joined the other monks, young and old. In silent file, we descended to the Ganges. The bath in the holy river was not optional. It was the first discipline of the day. That water, I have no words to describe the cold. It was like plunging into liquid needles. In the winter months, small layers of ice would form on the edges of the river. Putting my feet in that water demanded every ounce of willpower I possessed. The shock was so intense it took my breath away. But that was the intention. The belief was that this daily discipline, this deliberate shock against comfort, not only cleaned the body, but purified the mind and strengthened the spirit. It was a slap in the face that woke up not just my sleepy body, but my soul. It was the first step of the day to say no to the flesh and yes to the spirit. After quickly drying ourselves and putting on our robes, still shivering from the cold, we went straight to the meditation hall. The next step was pranayama, the breathing exercises. We sat cross-legged on the thin, cold straw, and Guru Shivananda guided us. We breathed in complex, rhythmic patterns, holding our breath for long periods. The philosophy was that by controlling the breath, we could control the prana, the life force that animates the body. By controlling prana, we could control the mind. And only with a controlled mind could we hope to reach higher states of consciousness. In the beginning, I felt dizzy, my lungs burned. I felt clumsy, unable to keep the rhythm. But, day after day, the practice began to create a strange type of calmness, a sense of controlled energy that I had never felt before. It was as if I was learning to pilot the machine of my own body in a new and much deeper way. Then came the meditation proper, hours on end, sitting in Padmasana, the lotus position, spine straight as an arrow, eyes closed. The goal was simple to explain, but almost impossible to execute, to stop the incessant flow of thoughts, to quiet the mind. In the first few days, it was absolute torture. It was not the torture of the river's cold, which was sharp and quick, but a slow, grinding torture. After 10 minutes, my legs would start to tingle and then burn. My back ached as if it were being pierced. And my mind, oh, my mind was a chaos. It refused to be still. It jumped to memories of my family, to the smell of breakfast starting to be prepared in the ashram kitchen, to the pain in my knee, to the itch on my nose. I would think, did I make the right choice? I'm a failure at this. I'm never going to succeed. But Guru Shivananda, in his afternoon teachings, told us this was normal. The mind, he would say, with his calm voice, is like a wild monkey, jumping from branch to branch, drunk and stung by a scorpion. Our job was not to fight the monkey, but to train it, with infinite patience, until it could sit quietly and focus on the eternal. After the long morning meditation session came the study of the scriptures. We sat in a simple room, with ancient copies of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. These were the pillars of our study. The Upanishads, mystical and profound texts that spoke of the nature of reality, of Brahman, the Absolute, and Atman, the Self. The Bhagavad Gita, the sacred dialogue where Lord Krishna teaches the warrior Arjuna about duty, devotion, and the different paths to God. We didn't just read, we memorized. In Sanskrit, we chanted the verses repeatedly, in unison, until the words and rhythm became part of our breath, part of who we were. The idea was that these sacred truths should permeate our subconscious. After the study came the work, the seva. We were not monks floating in clouds of meditation all day. The ashram needed to be maintained. Everyone had duties. Some worked in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and preparing the simple vegetarian meals. Others took care of the garden, where we grew our own vegetables and the flowers we used in the temple offerings. Some cleaned the guest rooms and the meditation hall. My duty was assigned to the small library. I had to catalog ancient texts, dust the shelves, and eventually help teach basic yoga to the Western visitors who came to the ashram seeking peace and enlightenment. Our meals were the very definition of simplicity, but they were also a rigorous spiritual discipline. We ate rice, dal, a thin lentil soup, some cooked vegetables, and chapatis, flatbreads. There was no meat, of course, but the restriction went much further. We did not eat eggs, nor garlic, nor onion. These foods were considered rajasic or tamasic. That is, it was believed that they agitated the mind, excited the passions, created restlessness, and therefore were direct obstacles to deep meditation. Food was seen purely as fuel for spiritual practice, nothing more. The idea was to reduce sensory pleasure to a minimum, so that the mind would not cling to it. We ate in absolute silence. Mealtime was, in itself, a form of meditation. We concentrated on each mouthful, on the texture, on the act of chewing and swallowing, treating the food as a sacred offering to the digestive fire within us. There was no talk, no distraction. It was a discipline of mindfulness, transforming a basic biological act into a spiritual practice. For me, it was a radical change coming from a home where my mother's food was an expression of love and celebration. Here, it was an expression of detachment and control. The afternoons were generally less structured, a time dedicated to personal study or individual practice. After the silent midday meal and helping to clean the kitchen, we had a few free hours before the afternoon duties. I usually used this time to get away. I climbed the small hills that surrounded Rishikesh, a place where the green of the vegetation was vibrant and the air felt cleaner. I would find a quiet spot under a large tree, far from the movement of the ashram, where the only sounds were the wind passing through the leaves and the distant singing of birds. Sometimes I would take the texts we had studied that morning with me, the Upanishads, and try to really penetrate their deeper meanings, beyond simple memorization. Other times, I just sat and meditated alone. It was not the formal, rigid meditation of the morning, but a more open practice. I tried to feel God in everything around me. I looked at a leaf, at an ant climbing a stone, at the flow of the Ganges below, and tried to see the unity of all things, tried to feel the presence of Brahman in every atom. It was a constant effort to dissolve the sense of the I, to try to merge my consciousness with the vastness of nature. The late afternoon brought more rituals. As the sun began to touch the mountains, the bell rang again, calling us back to the main hall for the evening arti. It was very similar to the powerful ritual I had witnessed at the Kumbh Mela, although, of course, on a much smaller and more intimate scale. We gathered in front of the images of the various deities we had in our small temple: Shiva, Vishnu, Durga, Hanuman. We lit oil lamps, swung incense and chanted bhajans, devotional songs. Music was an important part of this practice. The sound of the small cymbals, the harmonium, and our chants in unison filled the hall. It was a moment of bhakti, the path of devotion, which was an interesting contrast to jnana, the path of knowledge and analytical meditation. And I admit, in those moments, I sometimes felt something real, an uplift in my chest, an emotion that seemed to take me out of myself for a few moments. I felt a wave of devotion, a feeling of connection to something greater, as if I were momentarily touching the edge of something sacred. It was a welcome relief from the austere and mental discipline of the rest of the day. After the arti, there was another, usually shorter, meditation session in the twilight, followed by a very light evening meal, sometimes just a glass of warm milk with saffron or some fruit. And then, the mauna, the period of sacred silence. From 8 o'clock at night, talking was strictly discouraged throughout the ashram. The place plunged into a deep, almost palpable stillness. The goal was to turn the mind inward, quiet all social interactions, and prepare for sleep peacefully, without the agitation of conversation. We were supposed to be in our simple beds by 9 o'clock at night, to be ready to wake up at 4 in the morning and start all over again. The ashram was a place of relentless rhythm, of silence, of total introspection. My life became this cycle. Day after day, week after week, the months turned into years. 1 year became 2, 2 became 5, 5 became 10. I adapted. My body became strong and flexible with yoga and simple food. My mind, previously that chaotic wild monkey, became noticeably calmer, more focused. I was now, without any doubt, Swami Aravinda Ananda. I became known in the ashram as a serious practitioner, someone dedicated and disciplined. I delved into the practices with an all-consuming intensity. The discipline that was once torture now became my armor and my identity. I could do it. I could finally sit in meditation not just for an hour, but for 3, 4, sometimes 6 hours straight, without moving. The pain in my legs that used to scream at me was now just a distant sensation, a wave in the ocean that I could observe without identifying with it. My body became a tool I could command. I learned to control my breathing in ways that would seem impossible for an ordinary person. I could deliberately slow my heart rate, enter states of concentration so deep that the outside world, the sounds of the ashram, the heat, the cold, simply disappeared. I could, in fact, train my mind to sit still, exactly as Guru Shivananda had instructed. I became a master of the techniques of pratyahara, withdrawal of the senses, and dharana, concentration. I was the personification of the disciplined yogi monk. It was exactly what I had left home to become. And with this mastery, the experiences began to happen. They were exactly what the scriptures promised, what the older gurus described. During my deepest meditations, I started to have visions. Not visions of gods or goddesses, but something more abstract. I saw lights. Sometimes, a bright blue light in the center of my forehead. Other times, I felt my consciousness expanding beyond the limits of my physical body. I had clear sensations of floating, of being weightless, of my mind dissolving into the space around me. And, most importantly, I had moments of peace, a deep, vast, silent peace. Moments where all thoughts completely ceased. There was no I, there was no world. There was only a pure consciousness, a silent, full emptiness. These were the moments I sought. They were the proof that I was on the right path. They were the taste of samadhi, the state of unity that was the precursor to final liberation. Every time this happened, I felt victorious, felt that I was progressing, that I was getting closer to the final goal. Naturally, this dedication and these experiences did not go unnoticed. First, it was the other younger monks in the ashram. They started coming to me, instead of seeking the older teachers. They asked me technical questions about meditation postures, about how to deal with pain, about how to interpret certain difficult passages of the Upanishads. I answered based on what I had learned and experienced, and my answers seemed to help them. Then it was the visitors, people from India, and increasingly from the West, who came to the ashram seeking spiritual guidance. They started requesting private audiences with me. They were broken, confused people. They brought me their worldly problems, failed marriages, illnesses, financial worries, and the spiritual confusion that came with it all. I listened to them patiently, as my guru had listened to me, and offered advice based on the philosophy I had internalized. The philosophy of detachment, of karma, of seeking the eternal self beyond the temporary problems of the world. I became a counselor, a voice of calm and wisdom for them. My reputation began to grow beyond the gates of our small ashram. People stopped calling me Aravinda Andanda and started calling me Swami Ji, a title of deep respect. When I was in my early 30s, Guru Shivananda, already very old, began to ask me to give the evening discourses on the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. I discovered I had a knack for speaking, for translating complex philosophical concepts into simple language that ordinary people could understand. Groups of devotees began to come from larger cities, like Delhi, just to attend my lectures. I spoke about the nature of the self, about how the soul is eternal, divine, and immutable. I spoke about how all the suffering we experience comes from attachment, from the ignorance of our true nature. I explained that liberation, moksha, was not something to be earned, but something to be realized, a realization that came through knowledge and relentless meditation. Eventually, a wealthy devotee, a businessman from Mumbai, whose life had been transformed by my teachings, donated a piece of land and a significant sum of money for me to establish my own ashram. We called it Ananda Niketan, the abode of bliss. I was no longer just a monk. I was a teacher, a guru. I had my own disciples who came to seek the path of liberation through me. To anyone looking from the outside, my life was the definition of spiritual success. I had done exactly what I set out to do that morning in Rishikesh more than a decade ago. I had successfully renounced the world. I had disciplined my body and my mind to a level few achieved. I had mastered the knowledge of the scriptures. I was helping hundreds, perhaps thousands of other people on their own spiritual journey. People looked at me with a reverence that sometimes scared me. They literally touched my feet when I passed, a gesture of maximum respect reserved for saints. They sought my blessings for their children, their businesses, their health. They sincerely believed that I was close to enlightenment, or perhaps, as some whispered, that I had already achieved it. I was Swami Aravinda Andanda, the abode of bliss, a respected spiritual master. I had peace, I had purpose, I had respect. I had everything a spiritual seeker could desire. But there was something I didn't tell anyone. There was a secret, a hollow space, that I kept hidden in the deepest place of my being. There was a restlessness that, to my horror and confusion, persisted. There was a hunger, a spiritual hunger that, despite all my years of fasting and disciplined meditation, had not been satisfied. There was a question, the same question that haunted me since I was an 11-year-old boy watching my sister die, that all my study of the scriptures had not, in fact, answered. Did I have moments of peace? Yes, absolutely. Did I have experiences of deep stillness and light in meditation? I did, and they were real, but they always disappeared. They were not permanent. After every elevated meditation, after every sensation of samadhi, came the ordinary moment, the moment when I returned to my body, to my mind, and I was just Aravindandanda again. Just a man in saffron robes, trying to convince himself and others that he was progressing toward a final goal, a permanent state of liberation that, if I were brutally honest with myself, I had never truly achieved. I had achieved states of peace, but not the nature of peace. I would sit in my simple room in the ashram, late at night, long after all the disciples and visitors had gone to sleep. And in those moments of absolute silence, I was honest with myself in a way I couldn't be with anyone else. I admitted, to the darkness of the room, that I didn't truly know if moksha was real. I admitted that, despite all my mantras and meditations and breath control, I still felt fear. Fear of death, fear of failing, fear that, in the end, all this whole search, was just an elaborate illusion. I admitted in secret that I still got annoyed sometimes when a disciple was lazy or a visitor was disrespectful. I admitted that I still felt a pang of pride when people praised me. I admitted that I still felt pain when I was criticized. I had not, in fact, conquered my ego. I had just learned to hide it better, to dress it in spiritual clothes. And the question, that question, it remained. If God, if Brahman, is real and good and all that exists, why is there so much suffering? Why do innocent children die? Why are sincere prayers, like my mother's, not answered? And, the most terrifying question of all, why, after 33 years of relentless searching, had I still not found true peace? Not fleeting moments, but a peace that remained, a peace that nothing could shake. I never, ever, spoke these doubts out loud. How could I? I was Swami Aravinda Andanda. People depended on me. They came to me seeking answers, seeking certainty. If I, the Guru, confessed my own uncertainty, what would happen to their faith? I would destroy their world. So, I continued. I continued teaching. I continued meditating, perhaps with even more fervor. I continued performing the rituals, and I continued seeking, hoping that the next meditation, the next fast, the next level of discipline would finally be what would lead me to the final discovery. When I turned 52 years old, I had been a monk for 33 years, and I was tired. It wasn't physical exhaustion. My body was in excellent shape. It was soul weariness. I was tired of seeking, tired of striving, tired of trying, with my own willpower, to reach a state of liberation that seemed to always move just beyond my grasp. There was something inside me that was screaming for help, although I had no words or a name for who I was screaming to. It was in this state of silent desperation that I made a drastic decision. I decided I would make one final, supreme effort. I would undertake a 40-day fast, only on water, in an isolated cave in the mountains near Badrinath. Badrinath is no ordinary place. It is one of the most sacred pilgrimage sites in the Himalayas, a temple dedicated to Lord Vishnu, situated amidst snowy peaks and an ancient, raw power. It is a place where monks and yogis have gone for millennia to seek the divine darshan, vision, to perform their severest penances, to, literally, get closer to the gods. It was the perfect place for my final effort. I announced to my disciples at Ananda Niketan that I was withdrawing for a deep and solitary sadhana. They were visibly worried, almost panicking. A 40-day fast on water alone is not a common spiritual practice. It is an extreme risk. It is dangerous for anyone, but especially for a 52-year-old man. They tried to dissuade me, suggested shorter fasts, less severe practices, but my determination was absolute, inflexible. There was a voice inside me, a powerful intuition that said this was my last chance. I felt I needed to push myself to the absolute limit of human effort. I had to completely empty myself of food, of comfort, of everything, until nothing was left of me. My desperate hope was that, in this state of total emptiness, this final despair, I would finally break through whatever veil still separated me from the truth. It was all or nothing. I found a small cave, little more than a crack in the rock, about a 2-hour arduous walk from the nearest village. It was exactly what I was looking for. Total isolation. The altitude was high, the air was thin and cold, even though it was summer. The wind constantly howled through the rocks, a lonely sound that seemed like the lament of the world itself. I prepared my simple space. I unrolled my meditation mat on the uneven stone floor, placed my single rough wool blanket beside it. I brought nothing with me except gallons of water, which I had to laboriously carry up there, my most essential prayer books, and a small old photograph of my guru, Shivananda. And then I began. The first week was, as expected, physically brutal. The body, accustomed to decades of a feeding routine, screamed in protest. The hunger pains were sharp, almost like cramps. I felt dizzy every time I stood up. My energy plummeted, but I clung to my discipline. I spent the entire days in meditation and chanting mantras. My voice weakly echoed in the small cave. I watched the sun rise and set over the snowy peaks on the other side of the valley, a beauty so vast and impersonal that it made me feel like a speck of dust. I felt close to something, but I didn't know what. Close to nature, close to death, perhaps. In the second week, something changed. The physical weakness became my normal state. Standing up was a monumental effort, so I spent almost all my time sitting or lying down. My body began to consume itself, but, paradoxically, as my body weakened, my mind became strangely active. My thoughts, which I had trained for 30 years to control, began to fragment, to become bizarre. And then the visions began. They were vivid. I saw gods and goddesses that I knew from the scriptures, floating before me in the darkness of the cave. I saw demons with terrifying faces. I saw memories of my childhood with absolute clarity. Mira's face smiling at me, the smell of my mother's incense. I heard voices. I knew, on some level, that they could be hallucinations caused by extreme hunger, isolation, lack of oxygen. But they were so real. I could no longer clearly discern what was a vision, what was a dream, and what was the reality of the cave. I was losing my anchors. In the third week, the acute physical hunger stopped. It was a relief. My body seemed to have accepted its fate and stopped fighting. I felt light, almost weightless, as if I were floating. And yet, amidst this weakness and the chaotic visions, a new sensation began to emerge. It was a strange clarity, a feeling of being on the threshold of something. I could feel it. It was like the feeling in the air before a violent storm. A stillness charged with electricity, an expectation. I felt like I was at the breaking point. By the end of the 5th week, I was almost completely immobile. I had completely lost track of time. Day and night merged into a twilight blur, measured only by the movement of the small strip of light at the cave entrance. I wasn't exactly sleeping anymore, nor was I exactly awake. I floated in and out of some other state of consciousness. I saw light, a pure, brilliant light, filling the cave, even though I knew it was dark. I heard sounds, like celestial music, that seemed to come from very far away, or perhaps from inside my own head. I no longer knew, and I stopped trying to know. I was just surrendered. On what I, later, calculated to be the 40th day, I woke up. Or maybe I didn't wake up because I wasn't really sleeping. It was more like emerging. I emerged from a state of semi-consciousness into a clarity that was almost painful. The sun was just beginning to light the sky outside, painting the cave opening with a pale blue-gray. I felt strangely, deeply, at peace. Not the peace I sought in meditation. Not the peace of samadhi, which was an empty stillness. It was a different peace. It was a peace of readiness. It was as if everything in my life, every ritual, every question, every year of discipline, every day of fasting had led me inexorably to this exact moment. I sat up. It took a tremendous effort. My body was a skeleton covered in skin, fragile as dry paper. I looked out at the mountains, at that vastness of stone and sky, and I felt very, very small, and very, very ready. I closed my eyes. I was going to meditate one last time. I started chanting the Gayatri mantra mentally, the most sacred prayer I knew, the prayer for light and wisdom. Om Bhur Svaha. But, somewhere in the middle of the mantra, my mental voice stopped, my breath stopped, and then everything stopped. I felt it. A cold I had never felt before, not even in the icy waters of the Ganges in winter. This cold did not come from outside. It came from within. It started in my feet, a frozen numbness, and began to rise through my legs, through my torso, like a slow, inevitable tide. I tried to breathe, but my lungs did not respond. I didn't panic. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids didn't obey. An enormous weight, as if the mountain itself was upon me, pressed my chest, and I knew, with a bizarre and absolute calm, that I was dying. This was it. It was the end. It was the Mahasamadhi, the final liberation I had sought so much. Only it didn't feel victorious. It felt just the end. My soul was leaving my body. I was going to merge with Brahman, the Absolute. My suffering, my search, my hunger, everything would finally end. And in my last moment of consciousness, I did what I was trained to do for 33 years. I surrendered. I didn't fight. I let go. I surrendered to the cold, to the weight, to the darkness. And then there was nothing left, only darkness and silence. And I knew nothing more. But that was not the end. What happened next? I have no human language to describe. I have no philosophical or theological concepts from my 33 years of study to explain. It was not a vision. It was not a dream. It was not a hallucination caused by the fast. It was more real than the cave, more real than my own body, more real than Guru Shivananda. The darkness did not last. It opened, and I was pulled into a light that was not like the sun, which blinds. It was a light that was, itself, consciousness. It was a light that was love. I felt a presence of such power and holiness that my whole being, my bodiless soul, trembled. And this presence knew me. It knew my name. Not my monk name, Aravinda Andanda, but my child name, Arvind. I heard my name called, not with sound, but with a voice that echoed within my very essence. And the love that came with that voice, it was unbearable. It was a love that saw every one of my flaws, every moment of pride, every doubt, every secret sin, and loved me anyway, totally and completely. I did not see gods. I did not see the impersonal Brahman. I felt a person, a personal holiness. And I knew in that instant that everything I had sought was wrong, or rather, incomplete. The truth was not a state of being. It was him. And then, as abruptly as it began, it ended. The light disappeared. The presence retracted. The overwhelming love was replaced by a sensation of falling, of being pulled back, to the weight, to the cold, to the pain. I felt an electric shock. A violent spasm shook my chest. Air entered my lungs with the force of an explosion, a desperate gulp that burned my dry throat. The air turned into a cough, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed in the small cave. My eyes opened. I was looking at the gray stone ceiling. I was lying on my mat. The smell of dust and my own dirty body filled my nostrils. I was back. I was alive, but I was not the same. I raised my hand, trembling violently, and touched my chest. My heart was beating hard, like a frantic drum. I started to cry, a crying that was not of sadness or joy, but of pure shock and awe. What had happened? Had I died? Had I seen God? Or had I gone mad? I had no answers. I only knew two things. I was alive, and I had found something, or someone. And Swami Aravindayananda, the master of himself, the Guru, no longer existed. I was just Arvind, and I had no idea what to do next. I died in that cave as Swami Aravinda Ananda and came back to life. But what I found on the other side was not what I searched for 33 years.
The question remains, have you ever had an experience so real that it shook everything you believed? What do you think happened to me in those final moments in the cave? Leave your honest opinion here in the comments. We really want to know what you felt upon hearing this testimony. If this account touched you, don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. It's the only way to guarantee you won't miss the next transformative content we're preparing. The journey is just beginning. Click on the next recommended video that is now appearing on your screen. Thank you for watching. God bless.